look a little bit strange, but if I move it here, depending on the direction, and if I'm going to show you my setup, if I zoom out here, you see I have my computer right here, and I'm listening to my Clown World News, and I have the sculpture here. I also have reference up on the thing, but one of the things I am looking for is to give it an expression. And it's very difficult. The thing I'm finding is that because the head is tilted this way, it's much easier to work on the anatomy of this. But I'm trying to finish this right side of the head, and I did leave the sculpture unbagged without a covering, so it is harder. So at this point, when the clay is almost like leather hard, see, it's not sticking, and you can always get it to the natural wet type of clay just by spraying lots of water, and eventually it'll start to hydrate itself again. But at this point, it's almost a little bit easier to have it a little bit on the drier side, because you can carefully go around, say, the eyes and kind of push it up without it being too soft. So when you have it and it's a little bit soft, you start to like mush things together. So if you're working on details and you want to get a little bit more careful with the details, you can leave it uncovered, and you can use some sharper tools like this to bring out some details that otherwise you would not be able to get unless it was hard. So if it was soft, you would not be able to get those details. But since it's getting harder, the clay is getting harder, it's, if I wanted to say burnish an area, let's say one of the things that I do is, for example, any bone that comes to the surface, I try and burnish it. And burnish it just by taking a flat tool and making it, I guess you can say, shiny. But, for example, the zygomatic bone that comes out here, I might make it a little bit like flatter. That way, when you look at the light, when you look at some of the structure, for example, right over here, I can really kind of make it a little bit, so it's almost the coloring effect that we're going after right here. But when you have it in a very dramatic light like this as well, you can absolutely make it a little bit more realistic if you wish, or geometric. A lot of people, so in a way, when it becomes harder, it's as if you're carving instead of modeling. I've been working on it, and if you can tell from the face, I have been putting a lot more detail on it. I've been looking at some Hellenistic sculptures, and one in particular it's made after a constellation, and it's a really cool sculpture. So it gave me the idea to make it almost Hellenistic and flat in the face. That way, I don't know if it's successful, but as you can tell, I did leave it without the bag overnight, and it's definitely hardened up. And like what I mentioned before, there's a lot of other things you can do when you're sculpting to sculpt in a little bit of a harder clay. That is one of the flexibilities of having water-based clay. You can kind of play around with the consistency. So if it's too dry, all you do is wet it, and it dries almost immediately. So it's wet, but because the clay has gotten drier, it just kind of soaks in all the water. And I'm glad I didn't dry it too much, because if you dry it too much, what happens is that, like, for example, where the armature is here, it pushes it down, and oftentimes it'll develop a crack and sometimes even break. So if this breaks right here, this will just fall on the floor. So very important not to over dry it with this still on there. But with this sort of armature, I can undo this, undo that, and just kind of remove it and pop it out. So how am I going to fire it? And I think what I might do, this might actually be able to be fired without any hollowing out. But there's a couple options that you can do to make a permanent sculpture. So after you remove the armature, and you could try firing it with this very slowly without even like hollowing it out and see if it'll work. The second option, I think the option that I might be going with is cutting it right here at the waist, removing it, putting it on a different platform, hollowing out the torso, maybe up to here. You don't need to get to the head. And then hollow out the legs. And you might want to figure out, you need to probably at the joints put a little bit more clay, because I think my goal is to glue it back together. So it's good to have a little bit more of a bigger, thicker, where I'm going to be making the cut, getting it a little bit more clay. That way when I put it together after it's fired, I can put glue in that surface and have a good bond without having to put any metal and stuff like that. And then of course I'll dig out this. So that's the second option. Another option that's still a pretty decent option and very easy to do, and I think it'll guarantee results. So for example, you can hollow it out, say dig a hole here, hollow out the torso, hollow out the legs, and simply just leave a hole, like a pin, like the size of this brush. Just kind of going into that hollow after you, cover it up a little bit. And then fire it, and then afterwards cover it with some sort of putty or glue, and then paint it. And you would never see it. So what I intend to do is really just cutting it, because I think you'll have a higher chances of success in firing if you do it in a half. And also another thing to consider, that when I remove the top, it'll be very light, and then I'll be able to completely remove the clay in between here, sculpt the legs, and then even cut over here, and then I can put like a piece of metal here just to kind of really hold the sculpture together. So that's just some thoughts in my head, but this is the status of the sculpture. It's taking a while to do, and normally it does take me a while to sculpt at this point. But once you get it after a certain amount, you have to kind of determine how much detail you want in the sculpture.